Well, hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Stack, the show about what should be in the modern day freight tech stack. Today, I am joined by Mr. Eytan Buchman. He is a representative of Freightos. And Eytan, before we get into today's topic, I always want to make sure that our listeners know exactly who they're talking about. Now, just for our listeners, I want you to know that Eytan is not a stranger to podcast. By night, he's a podcast host, and by day, he's helping make global trade better at Freightos as CMO. So why don't you tell us a little bit about your journey, Eytan, and how you got into the world of freight, and maybe a little bit about what Freightos is all about?
Sure. Well, I mean, first of all, Adam, thank you so much for having me. Real privilege to be here. Yeah, some great start-off questions there. I feel like I could just riff for an hour off of that alone. I think like most people, I don't grow up dreaming about getting into international freight. I always kind of more had my like target set on astronaut or firefighter, something a little bit more sexy.
And your kids will want to be YouTubers just as mine soon. So no more astronaut aspirations in the future. YouTube is
true.
it.
Yeah, well, I've been pushing containers on them hard. Like when they started to like do watercolors, I was like, let's paint a picture of a boat, right? Like everyone wants to see a picture of a container ship. And tried to get them into like container bingo while we drive around and kind of spot containers. Not really working
Smart
so well.
dad.
Yeah, so I really came to this for the tech, not logistics. And over the past 10 years or 8 years, I've kind of caught that freight bug. I was in career military for a long time, strategic planning, communications, PR, these like very soft skills that are a little bit hard to commercialize into high tech. But I've always been a little bit of a geek, and I basically spoke to an investor who spoke to an investor who introduced me to a couple of other people who put me in touch with Zvi Schreiber, the founder of Freightos, back in the very early days. I don't even think we were called Freightos then. We were Freightos, I believe. We weren't always named after a corn chip. And he basically sat down with me, started walking through this vision of international freight. And I walked out thinking like, okay, I don't really know what you're talking about. Like freight is just like it's like a substrate. I don't really know what that was. I walked out, started reading up a little bit more and really got into it. So, in short, kind of what he pitched to me then, just to give the quick Freightos overview, is that he's building an Expedia for international freight. He used to import goods from China to the US, and he always got a little frustrated when trying to get into working with freight forwarders. He always felt like the process was a little bit too slow, used to take a little bit too long, that there wasn't transparency. Prior to that, he had been in this B2B network or B2B networking space, and he figured like, hey, I could just do this. Let me just start a company without any logistics experience besides kind of the own frustrations that he had. So I kind of spent a while throwing it around my head and then just got really into it and just I'll end with this like tirade with this, but the kind of journey that I took for getting into freight. I'm from Chicago, huge Cubs fan. When the Cubs ended up winning the World Series a couple of years ago, the first article that I shared was this Bloomberg article about the supply chain challenges of getting the championship baseball caps out to everybody on time. And right after I clicked like share, I was like, I know that's like, I'm over the deep end. Like, why am I sharing a supply chain article about the Chicago Cubs? But that, yeah, it's been a crazy journey. I was like employee 5 or 6 at Freightos, and now we're 250 around the world. So it's been really, really fun.
Yeah, it's an exciting time in freight. And I'm a marketer, you're a marketer, and, we have our own supply chain in our job, if you think about it. We have to source materials. We then, have to use those materials to help produce content. We've got to collaborate with people cross-departmentally to make sure that content is relevant to our target audience. And then we have to distribute it effectively. There's a difference in our job, though, in our brothers and sisters who do actually manage freight and have to be a part of that process, whether they're a freight forwarder, carrier, shipper, or some other broker or intermediary. And we have way less volatility. In fact, we can actually plan ahead of time. And if it's snowing like it had been here in my hometown of Frisco, or there's what we're dealing with in the global pandemic, it doesn't necessarily make our job any more volatile. And so that's what I want to really talk about today. And I think as an early, employee at Freightos, and as you kind of had to dig in as a marketer into this industry, one of the things that I think you and I both try to tell the story of our individual companies, whether it for me for Sonar and you for Freightos, is how technology really is not this magical solution that will make all of your lives better, but that it's a continuous improvement journey where you're really understanding what are my needs, what am I trying to achieve, and then how do I go out and find the tools that are allowing me to achieve those outcomes. And with all of the volatility that we're experiencing today because of the global pandemic, because of increased larger weather events, or maybe government regulation change like Brexit, or what we're seeing in the global trade environment between the tariffs that the US is putting on other countries, is how technology can kind of help hedge some of those disruptions, right? Or some of that volatility. And in fact, there was a recent Washington Post article here that I want to quote by David Lynch, and it talked about 1 year after the coronavirus pandemic first disrupted global supply chains by closing Chinese factories, fresh shipping headaches are delaying US farm exports, crimping domestic manufacturing, and threatening higher prices even for consumers, not just shipping higher cost, right? And so the cost of shipping of those container goods has risen by 80% since just November of last year. And so that's nearly tripled over the past year as well. And that's because of your Freightos Baltic index that he quoted there. Now, at Sonar, we have the Freightos Baltic index inside of our platform, so our subscribers can take a look at it. But I kind of want to make sure our audience understands what maybe an index is, and what is the Freightos Baltic index, and why is it critical, for not only those who ship containerized ocean freight, but maybe some of those who are interested on the impact of those imports coming inland to domestic areas, and how maybe they can understand trade demand.
Yeah. So, I mean, first, I think the best way to start with that is actually, you started with a little bit about how marketing kind of has its own supply chain. And obviously, they're totally different domains, but where marketers or software-centric solution providers kind of have an edge is the ability to keep their sonar out there, right? See what's happening and move quickly. Like, sure, you could have a podcast scheduled for 3 months from now, but if something big happens today, you're going to want to shift around that schedule and push it out. And because you're totally software based, you can actually monitor what's happening. You could turn around fairly quickly using the right stack of tools. And you're all about these stacks of tools. If you're monitoring it correctly and you have the right tools to empower you to work a little bit faster, then you can turn around really quickly too. Now, international freight can never be that flexible, right? You're talking about moving boxes, not bits. But at the same time, you still need those fundamental pillars of, am I listening to the right things? Am I monitoring what I need to monitor? Am I taking that in correctly? Am I using that as a relevant input in order to make the right decisions? And then how can I turn that into action? How can I start doing something a little bit better? And the FBX actually started more as a marketing tool almost, where we were running freight rate management platforms for large international freight forwarders, managing hundreds of millions of individual price points for international freight, ocean, air, trucking, really across the board. And we discovered that it's actually incredibly difficult to figure out at any given moment how much does it cost to ship a 40-foot container on core international freight lanes. And this is something that was a little bit, I guess we were surprised because we didn't come from within this space. But we were shocked that there is not any transparency into how much it costs to ship it. There's a couple of smaller freight indexes out there that try to, or other freight indexes that try to monitor it, but none of them have access to the raw data, access to the raw information of how much does it actually cost to ship. And using all of the software as a service that we were providing to companies with opt-in anonymous data aggregation, we were able to wrap it up and say, here's how much it costs to ship a 40-foot container on this specific trade lane. And we started doing that really just as a general source of kind of information for people that we were already working with. And slowly over time, it dawned on us like, hey, people really need this data. But in order to use it well, a really good index, if you think of the S&P 500 when you're talking about stocks, it needs to be rock solid. Like, not just the data collection and the data behind it, but you need to know that there's no manipulation there. And I think there's always a little bit of hesitation, certainly within logistics, but outside of logistics as well, about startups and tech companies in general, where it's a little bit of a black box. You don't know what's happening there. And I think that a certain amount of healthy suspicion is not a bad thing. What we ended up doing is partnering with the Baltic Exchange, which has been in shipping for, I think, 250 years. if not a little bit more. They started in coffee shops in the UK literally a couple hundred years ago. And we brought them in as a third party source of credibility. And then they also helped us get EU authorization or kind of compliance to make sure that we can be legally recognized as an index. And that kind of brought in a little bit more of trustworthiness and credibility. But in terms of what can you actually do with it, and this index or any other index, it's what we were talking about just a little bit earlier, which is monitoring. How can you make sure that you know what's happening and get that information fast enough? So if you're using international freight as or prices as a leading indicator, right, as of supply and demand, how fast are things changing? A, you can't wait a week because you need to make decisions today. And B, you need to have the right level of granularity. You need to know, is there a specific lane that's cheaper? Should I right now flip around my supply chain and try to ship to the East Coast rather than to the West Coast? And there, I think, is the other component, which is it's just not about finding the individual data sources. It's about aggregating it correctly. And I think Sonar does a fantastic job because the price of shipping to the West Coast, of importing a 40-foot container to the West Coast or to the East Coast, is worth nothing if you don't know how much does it cost then to get it from that port and bring it inland. And it's amazing. You could actually see a rotating. I think I spoke with someone at FreightWaves a couple of years back, where you could actually visualize a line down the middle of the United States, and that's constantly changing. Like, how far inland does it make sense for me to ship to the East Coast versus the West Coast? And that'll always fluctuate based on trucking and port prices, but also based on transit time. How long does it actually take to get to that? It's going to take longer, another 15 days, to get to New York rather than getting to Long Beach. So I think being on top of that information, just from a decision-making process, is so important to anyone who's running a supply chain. And we see a ton of interest, surprisingly, not just from importers and exporters or from logistics providers, but from carriers themselves, from the ocean liners themselves that are trying to get a sense of where is the industry, which shows you how little holistic information most companies actually have right now.
Yeah, it's fragmented. There's a lot of different players, and we don't always know every single one of them. But at the end of the day, companies like Freightos and Sonar, what we're trying to do is to get the most complete data sets that we can possible so we can provide that precision, and I know that's our goal. And our goal is also data integrity and to have it from a lot of different sides, whether that's historical or national, markets, historical meaning of your own data, or compared to national freight markets. So a collection of data points, or, bringing in maybe a consortium of people together, or partnering with other companies like you guys did with the Baltic exchange. And I think that is a pretty big, important aspect of what a technology provider can do. And when people are really considering what should be in their tech stack, and you're a freight manager and you're responsible for this massive, maybe even billion-dollar freight budget, it's pretty easy from my seat to sit here as a marketer and say, well, technology is going to, really solve all of your problems. But, we've got to be able to say, hey, here are some real use cases. Here's how you can really use technology. So when your team is talking to potential customers or current customers, when you're talking about this period of volatility, how do you talk to them pragmatically about using your technology to find capacity in a container, or using technology to make the process of procurement more efficient? Or finally, how do they work on reducing some of those costs? Because I think that's the questions. People are going to understand the value of data and analytics and the value of technology. But just like you and I experienced maybe in 2010 with the rapid evolution of marketing technology, we had to sort the wheat from the chaff, right? We had to see, how does this actually help me in social media? How does this help me do better at ranking in search engines, etc.? So what are some of those use cases specifically that you guys have talked about in using the Freightos technology or technology in general to customers and new prospects?
Yeah, so I absolutely agree that it really does start with the use cases. I think in general, the types of companies that we work with split into two different main personas. The first is, and I'll use the marketing technology stack analogy again, I love to poke around online, find interesting tools, and just sign up and see if it works. Like, that's just like a side project. I think if you think about Crossing the Chasm, which is like a famous tech book about software adoption, there's like 2.5% of people that just love finding new toys and playing around with them. And that's helpful. You find some interesting people that help you kind of generate new ideas for use cases. I think it's definitely the minority. there is a kind of bridge through that where something very interesting happening in international freight or freight in general is that so many more companies are building out larger tech stacks, and that's putting the onus on the individual companies, the technology companies, to make it easier to integrate and easier to play around and click around and maybe pull in software from one place, but data sources from another place, and then mix and match it together. In terms of the actual use cases, one interesting one that came up over the past couple of weeks, and this is, we kind of stumbled across it because somebody was doing it with our index. Right now, you're looking at prices that are 3, 4, 5, 6 times higher than they've been historically for international freight. At the same time, most large companies are going out and getting ready for their annual tenders for how much they pay for a 40-foot container. Now, that's not a very friendly market to go out and start signing annual contracts for, knowing that right now prices are hugely inflated. At the same time, this is uncharted territory. You have no clue. Now, I have no clue what prices are going to be in another month, another 2 months, or 5 months. If you had asked me, and I'm sure I'm on record in interviews from November saying it can only go so high. And it turns out it could only go so high, but then it could go a little bit higher past that. So one kind of interesting use case that popped up, we had a Fortune 100 company that was using us, who basically was taking our index and going out to their large carriers and saying, I want to negotiate an index-linked contract. I will sign up for a minimum order quantity of X number of containers, and I will always pay 0.98%, for example, of the Freightos Baltic index for China to the US West Coast. And that right there, instead of going back and forth and spending days, literally weeks of man hours on negotiating rates and looking at each individual lane and trying to come up with how many containers you need to send on, less used lanes in order to get better prices on the more frequent lanes, they're just cutting that all down into by 5, 10, 20x and saying, I'll always pay this specific alpha on an index. And that gives them a little bit of control. At the same time, or a little bit of control over the volatility. At the same time, for most companies, if you approach your CFO and you tell them that, they'd flip, because it gives a little bit of control, but at the same time, that means that they're essentially signing up over the next year to pay an unknown price, right? They can't calculate that into their actual inventory cost because they know that it's index linked, but they don't actually know what it'll cost. So usually some companies will try to maybe hedge some of their containers. Say I'll pay 20% will be linked to the index, 80% will not be, and that'll help me get a little bit of control. Another very interesting use case that we saw kind of in that same tender negotiation space was trying to use the index to create boundaries and say, if at any point the price goes this far away from the Freightos Baltic index, up or down, in order to protect the carrier and the BCO, then let's stop and renegotiate the contract. So I think what it's really doing is it's given some type of boundary for where is the market, what is the market going to be, and that way, even if the market escapes a little bit too much, you're still a little bit protected.
Well, and I think you're really hitting on, with your mention earlier about carriers continuing to get more interested in data themselves, and what you're saying here in the negotiation process. We saw something very similar in the truckload side where, our customers at Sonar were using our data because of the spot market really took off. And as we headed into contract season in 2021, towards the end of the year, in that short period of time where the spot rates were just so high, our freight brokers and shipper customers were using it to help inform some mini bid exercises. And they were going to carriers and saying, hey, here's what we're seeing in the data for these lanes. We have a lot of density here, we don't have a lot of density here. And so they're really working together with that carrier collaboratively, or as a shipper with that freight broker collaboratively, to maybe reorganize their transportation network, maybe a little bit different than they ever had before. And they're getting that individual lane detailed data in order to, do that analysis and start putting together those short-term contracts. But as we get into that period now, what we're doing and seeing in the freight market on the truckload side are those same annual contracts. And increasingly, a lot of our carrier customers are coming up against our freight broker customers in those contracts, and they're both using data to collaborate and get more of a mutual agreement that can help both parties stay profitable, and that both parties can put in some triggers, as you mentioned, that can help hedge some of this potential volatility, because nobody saw the pandemic coming. Nobody saw the ice and snow in Dallas coming. Nobody saw the fires in Australia last year. So who knows what's coming down the pipeline? So it seems that technology and increasingly data and analytics within these platforms are really helping increase the spirit of collaboration and getting out of this zero-sum game mentality. What are you guys seeing in your customer base or out there in the industry on collaboration? Is that a soft, squishy word that us marketers make up, or is that something that's actually happening now?
Right. No,
Because of technology?
I think it's there. I mean, we're all, within international freight or within freight in general, I think everybody's just kind of scrambling to latch onto something concrete, to understand what's actually happening right now in the world. And price seems to be a really easy way to start. And I certainly don't want to make this all about prices, right? Like right now, you could pay $9,000 for a container. That's not worth it if your goods don't get there on time. At the end of the day, you're not paying for a container. You're paying to get your goods from A to B. And that's like the fundamental truth of freight is that, or for supply chain in general, is nobody cares about the price of your container. Nobody cares about the transit time. You care about, I have to get it there by X. What's the optimal solution to do that? I was speaking to somebody from Johnson & Johnson a couple of months ago, and I mentioned the word big data, which is just what everybody, I kind of cringe when I talk about it. But I asked him what his perspective of big data was, and he said, well, look, within Johnson & Johnson, even on the supply chain side, one thing we'll monitor is social media. I was starting to think, like, how on earth could Twitter be related to Johnson & Johnson supply chain? And basically it's talking about how, well, you'll see early indicators when people are, having headaches, and will suddenly, whether there's a bad weather, bad allergy season, and suddenly you'll see an uptick in people talking about runny noses and sneezes, or, oh my God, my nose is so stuffed, and like so a couple of emojis. And that's a forward-looking indicator of where things going to be in a couple of months, or where things going to be in a couple of days. Now, I'm using that as, that might be a little bit of a far out example, but really, in order to create the most perfect picture, any company, and this is Johnson & Johnson, right, one of the largest companies in the world, if they need to go to external sources like Twitter, it should not be a source of kind of a feeling of embarrassment or failure to know that there might be other companies that have better data sources than you, right? That's okay. Like I use external data sources all the time. Every company out there uses data sources all the time. And I think that's the easiest place to start collaborating. Because, as you said before, it's not that takes it out from the zero-sum game. I can share data with everybody and it costs me the exact same thing. Maybe I'm paying a couple of, points, 0.004 cents per Google BigQuery lookup that anybody does. But I can share that with anybody and it costs me nothing. But at the same time, other people are getting huge amounts of advantage out of it. So I think it's just such a great way to step over the start line and start working with a new type of company and start figuring out where you can start working together. I think that's why on the ocean freight side, there's a sudden spike in standards, in digital standards that are being created. And it's starting with track and trace and with visibility, where even carriers talking between themselves are saying, yes, I want to share that type of data because there's going to be a net win for everybody. So I absolutely think it's such a great foray into collaboration because it's such an easy place to get started.
Absolutely. And it's kind of like a freight tech Maslow hierarchy of needs, we're continuing to evolve, which is great. And, and after collaboration, what's the next evolution? Well, it's not just surviving and figuring it out and becoming efficient. It's getting to a bigger place, right? And the world of freight and the world of supply chain has such an impact on our society, right? And when we can collaborate and work together, and maybe we've really worked to root out the waste, and when volatile times come, we're able to absorb it more quickly. It's not that it won't be painful from time to time. I don't think we could ever promise eliminating the pain that some of these disruptions cause. But when you have the tools or the mechanisms to respond in kind, then you at least have this confidence to move forward and not let it just bring you down all the way to the bottom of that Maslow hierarchy of need pyramid. And so once that technology is in place, you're becoming more efficient, you're collaborating better, you're thinking about maybe bigger picture items. It allows you to get higher in that pyramid where you can maybe work on reducing carbon emissions or improving packaging or not wasting space on a container or a truck. And so how do you see, what are the next big things that technology is going to allow the supply chain? Let's think beyond the pandemic for a second. What's going to happen in late 2021? What is technology going to allow companies to focus on next? Is it more e-commerce? Is it reducing emissions? Is it playing a bigger role in the C-suite? What do you think?
Yeah, great question. And continuing the riff from the previous question, which is, talking about the role that data can play here, is that the best data in the world is worth nothing if you can't do anything about it, right? So if you want to short GameStop while you're following it online, but you can't actually click the button because, I don't know, some type of digital stockbroker won't let you press the button, that data is absolutely worthless for you. Or if you're not integrating that data or synthesizing that data correctly, it's absolutely worthless for you. I don't think, and I think about this a lot, I don't think that the way that goods are moved is fundamentally going to change over the next couple of years, right? Like come 2035 even, goods are still going to be moved on containers and in ULDs on airplanes and on full truckloads and less than truckloads. Maybe there'll be a robot driver, maybe there won't be a robot driver, I don't know, but it's still going to be the same pallets, right? That's not going to change overnight. It's worked for 60 years, it's going to work for another 60 years. Maybe some of them will be a hyperloop, maybe there'll be a couple more going to the moon, but it's going to be the same thing. And that means that we're not actually changing fundamentally the physical way that goods are moved. We're changing the way the bits and bytes behind the physical flows are actually going to move. So when you kind of create those constraints of what's going to actually change there, I think there's two things that I'm really excited about. The first is what I'd call legibility, which is how can I actually take more things or events that are happening in the real world and translate that into the digital world. When you think of like autonomous cars, the main reason that autonomous cars are suddenly a potential is that you can suddenly take all of the things that are happening in real life as a car is driving, throw a LiDAR radar on top of that car or under that car, and make all the real life events legible for the car so it could start to process it. You could get that data collection. And on a day-to-day basis, there's a this is a little bit of a kind of ripoff, or maybe not hugely important to everybody, but there's a company called Bottomless that basically sells coffee, and they will give you a Internet of Things coffee grind holder for your house, and it'll automatically monitor when your coffee beans are about to end, so they can send you some more coffee beans. And that's legibility. That's taking something that happens offline and turning it online. And that's one thing that Freight is doing in spades right now. Visibility is only as good as how much can I bring in real life events. Where are goods? Are they being flipped over? Temperature? Is there a lot of goods that are suddenly backed up somewhere, like a Waze for international for domestic freight? That legibility is something that's really interesting. Skipping over like 16 different steps after that, that same collaboration around data and integrating different data, one thing that I think is going to open the floodgates for is not just let me share information with you, but here, I'll let you press a button on my system. Like we have an API that's connected. We don't need to talk to each other. And we can't be more than 5 years away from an ERP somewhere identifying that a clothing company is missing 16 red sweaters and noticing that there's another 10 stores that have that, putting in an order for 3 different factories, finding the right factory internationally, that same exact ERP, finding the right shipping solution, shipping in real time, identifying something going wrong, and finding a different freight forwarder in order to handle it. And that's all not kind of built on that Maslow hierarchy you're talking about data connectivity, but taking it one step further and saying, fine, we're connected. Now you can press a button. Now you can book something. Now you can track the freight. Now you can reroute it somewhere else. And I think those two things are probably the things that I'm most excited about what's going to change over the next couple of years.
Yeah, and a lot of us will become more intimate with data and technology. And as we continue to get up, that Maslow hierarchy of needs, and we put, these things in our freight tech stack, and we as organizations and companies get more sophisticated and used to that, it's going to allow us to put the focus back on where it matters. And that's the customer, ultimately, to make sure that we can, go out and gain revenue, and they have a great, feeling about us as a company, so that we can do big items that the world is facing, whether it's climate change or something like that. And that's what technology can do. I think early on when I started my career, there was some scaredness out there, some fear about robotics and automation replacing humans. But I think what we've largely found is that it's really actually making us more strategic, and we're not as mired down, i.e. losing waste, which costs a lot of operational costs and can pull down your profits. And we're allowed to, focus on the big picture items that allow our companies to grow, allow us to hire more people, and allows us to make global trade better at Freightos or make freight procurement here in the domestic side on the truckload side with Sonar at our users' disposal. But this was a really good conversation about how technology can hedge risk and volatility. Thank you for coming on to the podcast today, Eytan. I'm excited to continue to work with Freightos and you to help put out that message of the importance of technology. So thanks again for coming on and lending our listeners a little bit of your thoughts today.
It's a pleasure. Thank you so much, Adam. This was fun.
All right. Take care. And for all our listeners out there, we'll see you on the next episode.